Well, good afternoon or good evening, as the case might be, or good morning for those who are around the world in other locations. This is Conversations with Andrew Williams Jr., Concordian Conversations. And as you see, we're in the midst of a Juneteenth 2023 weekend event. Today is June the 18th, 2023, and we're co-hosting this with Stuart Sinclair Weeks, who is the founder of the Center for American Studies at Concord in Massachusetts. And so, Stuart, if you're ready, now's the time to introduce yourself to our audience. However, I see you're still there jiggling with your device. So let me continue to tell you that we're here in Concord, Massachusetts, and you may or may not be able to see this button here. It says Stand Up for Ellen. This is Ellen Granger Jackson, who is a predecessor to Rosa Parks by 100 years. In 1866, when the Slave Act was passed, Ellen Granger and her mother, in a train station in Boston, refused to give up their seat. And they were forcibly ejected, this story goes. But she then, of course, took them to court. Now, of course, considering the circumstances, that event didn't turn out so well, but she did stand up for her rights. And now the entire city of Concord is being asked to stand up for Ellen. There is a school here, the Middlesex School, that is due for a reconsideration of their naming. So there is an effort here to uplift the image of what we now know as Black Concord to the status of the Concord that's known as the center of the center of the center. So here you are, my good brother, Stuart Sinclair Weeks.
Yes, good evening, at least here where we are. The school that may be named, we hope, appears to be named after Ellen Garrison, is one of Concord's public schools. And as Andrew had said, Ellen was a forerunner nearly a century before Rosa Parks. She took a stand, inspired by this community, Minutemen and women who fired a shot heard around the world by Concord's authors. So that speaks to an important reality that when communities find their treasures, not just could be a beautiful pond or beautiful hills, but they're human treasures as well, and those from history, and honor those treasures. And that gives the people in the community, particularly the young people, a sense that they're part of a living and vital legacy. Part of that, and we'll be there in an hour's time, a little under an hour's time at Monument Square in Concord Center. Part of that legacy has to do with a monument in Monument Square that's nearly invisible, that's knee-high to a grasshopper, which marks the jail that Thoreau went to for refusing to pay taxes for the war against Mexico, which for him was tied into the whole issue of slavery. This is a monument that's nearly invisible, and yet it was that night in Concord's jail, as I'm sure a number of you know, that inspired his essay, Civil Disobedience. And that essay, in turn, inspired millions upon millions of people, beginning in India alone, with Gandhi, but also with Tolstoy in Russia, with Mandela in South Africa, with Cesar Chavez in this country, with Dr. Martin Luther King, and many others. In fact, for Dr. King, both Thoreau and Emerson were major teachers. He spoke of both with deep appreciation. The issue of civil disobedience is a vital issue. It's based on Thoreau's views that they're higher laws, Thoreau's views that the state that sets down the lower laws is peopled by our public servants, by our elected representatives, and that the fundamental power resides in the people. This is more than just individualism. And this is more than just self-reliance. This is a reliance on the individual conscience. And that is what's behind the essay, Civil Disobedience. A sequel is unfolding entitled Uncivil Obedience that arose from a night spent in Concord's jail, standing up for our right to breathe freely, that is unmasked. And in this respect, the judges and lawyers in the international law courts of The Hague and other nations speak of masking as dry boarding, not wet boarding, as we've heard from the Guatemala
Right.
history, the tragic history, but dry boarding, or the first phase of asphyxiation. So this brings us to this whole question of how we find the right relationship to the state and to the laws that are passed down. We've all been confronted with this, with the pandemic, with all the pressure, some would say even the fear-mongering that has been around it to get us vaccinated, to get us masked, to get us socially distanced, or one might say anti-socially distanced and tested. So this is an issue that we with the Center for American Studies have been taking up in an open letter to Dr. Fauci, to the good inimitable Dr. Patch Adams, and to a young lad named O'Sheen, to look at what is going on with the fear-mongering that we've been exposed to 25 hours a day. Some may remember you couldn't even drive down the highway without all the advisories saying, get your vaccination, get your vaccination. With, as I mentioned, the social distancing, which has been very hard, particularly for older people. I know in the case of my father, it was very hard for him to be separated from his family. So I'm taking up a thread in terms of the center's work of what we refer to as applied American studies. That is how we can escort education down out of the ivory and ivy towers into the mainstream of life. How we can give our fellow citizens insights and understandings that can fortify them, can fortify their conscience, and thereby truly encourage them in their daily lives when we're confronted by many, many challenges, such as I've been mentioning, the pandemic itself. This was what Thoreau was up against. He took a stand that has affected, as I said, millions of people around the world. The stand he gave the name Civil Disobedience. And I think the adjective civil is critical because it doesn't mean as in civilization or society, but it means a respectful disobedience, a respectful standing up for our fundamental rights and responsibilities, including our right to breathe freely, a right for medical freedom in these challenging times. So friends, I'm alluding to something that I think many are aware of. I think for the moment, I'm not going to go into the greater length, but the Center for American Studies, we will have this open letter soon to be published to Dr. Fauci, to Patch Adams, and to this young lad, O'Sheen, that seeks to present another perspective on this pandemic and these tremendous challenges that have disrupted so many lives and undermined many, many businesses, economies, schools. President Roosevelt, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, said that nothing happens in politics by accident. If it happens, you can bet it was planned that way. My grandfather, who fought in World War I, the war to end all wars, in the blood, sweat, and tears of the trenches. He came back, he was elected to the US Senate. And when Pearl Harbor came, Roosevelt was at the helm, and none of our leaders could be reached when the leadership in Pearl Harbor tried to call Roosevelt and our Secretary of State Marshall and alert them to the fact that Japanese bombers appeared to be approaching. Neither were able to be reached. So the person at the helm was not available, and we had our day of infamy. I hope we can learn such lessons and take them in the right spirit. So with Henry David Thoreau in heart and mind, his work, his civil disobedience, we extend this offering this evening as part of our Juneteenth celebration, concerns that Dr. King understood well and that we're asked to carry on in terms of our engagement. Thank you very much, Andrew. Back to you.
Well, thank you so much, Stuart Sinclair Weeks. In multiple opportunities I've had today, for those who are aware of who I am, based usually in Los Angeles and now here in Concord, Massachusetts, I do need to tell you that in the short time I've been here, since April 19th, Patriots Day, just a few weeks ago, on a daily basis, I've experienced these touch points around Concord that are relevant not just to American history, but to my great surprise, to African American history. So this conversation now on this pre-Juneteenth opportunity we have forces me to bring this to your attention as well. Juneteenth, as you know, is now a federal holiday, recently enacted so by President Biden, and it's referred to as Freedom Day for a great many number of people, particularly those in Galveston, Texas, or the state of Texas, because it was on this or that day, June 19th, that they were officially informed that they were, quote, free. However, it is also a fact that there were over 200,000 others, Africans, who were still enslaved until December 6th of 1865, when the state where I was born, Georgia, became the 27th state to ratify the Emancipation Proclamation. So it's in that context of us sharing with you the history so that you become more aware of it and you take up this opportunity to become more civically educated about the circumstances that we're hoping to encourage you to also join what this is a part of. It's part of a citizens movement. As you know, or many of you may or may not know, there are so few corporations that hold so much control of the media globally. And by that, I mean 6 corporations, totaling 95% of the world's media content. That means that people like you and me and Stuart and others have to take our responsibility to use those tools that now perhaps we're only using for consuming content, to think about ways we can share what's happening in our local communities to become producers of content. You're experiencing that now. Conversations with Andrew Williams Jr. was founded in 2013, but it harked back to my own experience in 1973 as a high school editor. So I encourage our children, our youth, those who are much more able to take today's technology to convey information that they believe is very valuable, to do both things. Become more aware of how this world is interconnected, starting from where you are, and then explore the history, how you are connected locally, and then share that with us as we go forward. I'm going to briefly return this back to Stuart and Carol Weeks, but I do want to let you know the Juneteenth is not an event that's happening in a vacuum. This is actually part of a continuing effort on a global basis to give more recognition and appreciation to those people like me of African descent, although I am of African, Indigenous, and Anglo descent for that matter. But I am, in fact, as you can see, a person of African descent. The United Nations, in fact, has established this as a decade for people of African descent from 2025 through 2024. So please understand that this Juneteenth is just the first of a continuing series of events that I hope to coordinate through the Center for American Studies at Concord to involve other activities throughout the year, such as August 25th, which, again, as you may or may not know, is that, quote, official date where the first arrivals of the enslaved Africans did, in fact, touch ground in the Virginia colony, but not in Jamestown. It was actually in what is now Hampton, Virginia, at Point Comfort, then now Fort Monroe. So we hope to be explaining that as we go forward in our plans for 2024 to celebrate this rest of this decade for people of African descent. So Stuart, I'm going to turn this back to you for whatever the next step on the agenda is. Thank you.
Well, Andrew, we will be making our way soon to Monument Square. So a warm welcome for everybody to join us at 7 p.m. Eastern Time. We'll be on location. And we will turn to George Washington and Phyllis Wheatley, his spiritual consort, the Negro slave poetess. We'll turn to Ellen Garrison, and we'll turn to the Concord Covenant and Concord Fellowship. So a warm welcome to all. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. I'm going to share my screen again. And to join us, you can just simply click on the link, or at least type in this information at www.bit.ly/Concord-Juneteenth-23. And you can actually join us, not just for our next event, but for events that are happening throughout the next 27 hours. So thank you so much and have a fantastic evening.